we'll go ahead and get started. If at any point you have any questions, I think there's a participant option where you can raise your hand, but otherwise feel free to kind of just unmute your mic and ask if you'd like. Hopefully we can keep it kind of relevant to what we're discussing. I may request that, we kind of keep it to the end, or I might address it later on, or might say it'll come up, inshallah. So, but definitely feel free to ask and engage. So before we even get into the surah itself, there's a few introductory conversations that need to take place. Those introductory conversations really set the stage for number one, what framework the surah fits into, right? What was the historical context of the surah as it was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ, and really how can we kind of contextualize the surah and understand it in terms of things that are applicable to us. And so the first kind of overarching conversation that's really necessary when bringing or approaching the surah is the concept or the idea of worldviews. Okay, does anybody know what a worldview is, or if you do, what are some ways that worldviews manifest? Okay, so in short, right, worldviews are basically how we understand, or what we understand sources of truth to be, right, and how we conceive of the world and our place in it based on how we conceive of knowledge itself and where knowledge is derived and how we understand things, right, and what the function, the purpose of the world is, and what the function and the purpose of us living in it is. All right, it seems like really existential stuff, but it's really important. It's really important. A lot of the differences that you find between people in the world can really be boiled down to differences in worldview. And so what I mean by that is there, to kind of make it simple, you can either assume the world to be or knowledge to be derived from what you can perceive either through your senses or through what you can derive analytically by way of your senses, right? And by senses, I mean, your five senses, right? Or in addition to that, you can understand there to be sources of truth and sources of reality that extend beyond your senses and your ability to perceive things. Okay, one of the earliest explanations or descriptions of the believers in the Quran that as we find in the as it's organized, right, in the Quran, starting from Surah Al-Fatiha, is what we find in Surah Al-Baqarah. And one of the earliest descriptions Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives about those who can derive benefit from the Quran, right, or who can be guided through the Quran by means of the Quran, is that they are God-fearing, God-conscious people. This is the book in which there is no doubt, a clear guidance or guidance to those who have God consciousness, who are aware of God. And their first description is what? الَّذِينَ يُؤْمِنُونَ بِالْغَيْبِ, those who believe in the unseen. Okay, what are some aspects of the unseen that inform our lives as Muslims?
Could you repeat the question, brother?
Sure. What are some aspects of the unseen world that inform our lives as Muslims? So what are some things about the unseen that as Muslims we believe?
Maybe al-iman billah,
Okay, yes. So believing in God himself is a matter of the unseen, right? We have never seen Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, nor are we able to, but yet we believe, our belief in his existence informs our life in a very major way. Anything else beyond just that?
Belief in the afterlife.
Belief in the afterlife, right? Belief in a life after death, belief in a life after the grave even, and everything that comes along with that, right? Retribution, judgment, punishment, reward, having to answer for every single thing that was done, you know, a balancing of the scales, et cetera, et cetera. Anything else?
Some people are answering in the chat.
Oh, okay. Okay, Qadr, right? Sabir mentioned Qadr, right? Predestination or divine decree, as it's often translated. Jinn, that's another aspect of the unseen. Angels, the last day. Shahir, my classmate, thank you for contributing. So angels, right, as well. All right, so these are all important things. Now, are we the only community in the world that believes in the unseen or that claims belief in the unseen? No, right? We're not. Other faith communities believe in the unseen as well. The thing that is quite distinctive about faith communities in general and Muslims in particular is that their belief in the unseen is not a matter of philosophy. It's not a matter of theory. It's not a matter of academics that they kind of understand to be, you know, in a certain realm, in a specific time and place, and not in conversation with the world as they live in it, but rather our belief in the unseen informs every single thing about our life, okay? Be it from even as simple as what we understand to be true to begin with, right? We hold in the highest of esteem the sources of revelation and hold that as Muslims to be the capital T truth. Okay, so source of revelation being the book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the example and the life of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? It's important, and it kind of sets up the discussion. Why? Because the Surah al-Kahf, in it has, you know, a lot of recurring mention of these themes, right? Belief in God, retribution in the afterlife, you know, living according to God's will, according to God's guidance, living according to the Quran, right? The stark or the stern kind of warning to those who reject and deny God's way on this earth, right? These are all, you know, common themes throughout the surah. Understand or believing in the unseen, knowledge that comes from God, right? We'll talk about that in the future when we talk about the story of Musa alayhi salam and Khidr, right? Understanding knowledge, the unseen, God's wisdom. So these are very common themes. Now, the reason why I say that, you know, we believe these things in a serious and kind of way that affects our life day to day is because if I were to ask you, hey, you know, I'm sure you guys get asked this all the time, why don't you eat pork, right? Our kind of our rationalizing mind and our kind of desire to want to present an understanding that's palatable to people will kind of often lead us to to answer that question by saying, well, you know, pigs are filthy animals, right? And they have diseases, or they live in dirty environments, et cetera, et cetera. And so, you know, that's why, right? Has anybody kind of found themselves in a conversation like that, whether it be about pork, alcohol, interest, anything of the like? Why do you wear a scarf? Things like that.
Yeah, all the time.
Right. And do you find yourself kind of answering the question or having conversations that kind of sound a little bit like that?
Yeah, I have them. And then after I like immediately say, well, also because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told me not to.
Right. And I'm really glad that you mentioned that, because there's a very subtle but very important difference between those two answers. Okay. There are things that we can derive as wisdoms for why we do what we do. And oftentimes those wisdoms and understandings are explicit. The reason why you do this is because of this. The reason why you do X is because of Y. But oftentimes, and sometimes that wisdom is not as explicit, right? There are kind of reflections that we derive, benefits that we derive from why we do things, but ultimately it comes down to because God said so. Because God said so. Okay. I don't eat pork because God said so. And that may be true in addition to the fact that, you know, pigs are filthy, disease, et cetera, right? Sorry, I'm just catching up with the chat right now. Somebody said superstition, preachers on campus. Can you elaborate on that? Preachers on campus?
So sorry, you asked like, have you ever engaged in these conversations before?
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's like, mashallah, what you're saying is really useful too, because like when we were in person on campus, there would there would be preachers who came up to you and it's out of the blue and you're being questioned about like, why do you do this and this and why do you believe in this? And so it's just a nice reference, inshallah, what you'll be talking about.
Inshallah. Yeah, absolutely. And I found myself in that same situation. One day I was, on campus when I was in university, and I was just studying between classes or something like that. I was sitting in the business school, and this random guy comes up to me, and he just starts talking to me. And I'm like, wow, this guy's really nice. Usually people don't just strike up conversations with random people. And then as the conversation started going on, I started to realize, okay, well, this guy started to preach to me. And so he was talking about his experience as a Christian and how like he was living life a certain direction. And then he had this life-changing experience where this undescribable power came over him and all these other things. And basically he was trying to get me to to kind of cozy up to that idea and kind of go to his Bible study or whatever the case was, right? And I really like enjoyed that conversation, right? And we kind of went back and forth, and then when I kind of let him finish after like this 30 minutes or whatever, and I was like, all right, let me kind of start speaking now as well. And usually, typically, sometimes this is how these conversations go, is that he wasn't really as willing to hear what I had to say. But anyways, like I guess towards the end, he started realizing this is probably not the guy like that I'm really gonna have much luck with for whatever reason or the other. So he kind of just departed at that point. But I say that whole story to mention that it happens, right? It happens often. And in the world that we live in, it's very difficult sometimes to just suffice to say, well, because God told me to, and leave it at that. It almost seems like, well, that is an irrational, that is an illogical idea and belief to have, right? But we do have it, and it does inform our life in very important ways. So whether it be something like pork, whether it be something like, why don't you, for example, why don't you gamble? Or why don't you invest in interest-based assets, right? Why don't you, why are you very, discerning about where you put your money in certain stocks, for example? Why is it that you wear a headscarf? Why is it that you pray 5 times a day? Why do you do all these things? Why do you live your life, in a certain way, right? Why do you choose not to do certain things that otherwise we understand to be pleasurable things or things that bring pleasure? What Surah al-Kahf talks about is societies and people who live according to a materialistic worldview and who live according to a worldview that's informed by the afterlife and the unseen. Those who live according to a materialistic worldview, they live their life a certain way, right? They engage with their wealth in a certain way. Their goals and expectations and aspirations in life usually, follow a certain pattern. And those who are informed by the hereafter follow a different one, right? Their value for wealth, their value for material things, their value for status, their value for honor. And the common themes that Surah al-Kahf explores in this realm are around the test of faith, right? The test of faith, the test of wealth, the test of knowledge, and the test of authority and power. These are the 4 stories that are kind of highlighted, okay? In another place in the Quran, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the Prophet Shu'aib, one of the objections that his people give to him, they say, قالوا يا شعيب أصلاتك تأمرك أن نترك ما يعبد آباؤنا أو أن نفعل في أموالنا ما نشاء إنك لأنت الحليم الرشيد. Very, very powerful ayah. Does your prayer, okay? So they associated, first we understand, they associated his religion, his calling with prayer, with the act of prayer, okay? Does this prayer of yours command you to, to leave or command us that we leave the traditions of our forefathers or that we, does it mean that we're unable to do with our wealth whatever we want? Does this prayer of yours stipulate that we have to change the traditions and the culture of our society, and that we have to change the way we interact and deal with our business? And then they say, "Innaka la anta al-halimur rashid." Right? That is an absurd prospect. Surely you are more discerning, and you're all the way there in the head. We know you're an intelligent person, you're a smart person. So surely, like, you're smarter than that, right? That's not what you're saying, is it? And so it's very interesting, right? Because Shu'aib alayhi salam came from a prominent family. He came from a wealthy background, a family that had status in society. So they were saying, you're smarter than that, right? You're not so clueless as to believe that, like, whatever it is that you're calling to has to change our life and our tradition and the society that we've built, right? But they understood that there was something about this worship, there's something about this calling, this religion, that informed how they lived their life, okay? And that's why it was threatening to them. And that's why the prospect of faith-based communities is threatening to any power structure in society, right? People are typically okay with your religion and your way of life, so long as you keep it private and it doesn't affect any public arena of life. As long as you pray your 5 times in that little corner over there, that's all good. We don't have any issues with that. But as soon as you start questioning how we deal with our wealth, for example, how we deal with our people in society, right? How we, deal with the organization and the rankings and the structure of people in society, and how we value people in society, and what rank and honor and status that we give to certain people over others, and for what reason. As soon as you start questioning how that faith incorporates into your life is when you start having problems, right? That's why it's threatening to so many societies. So that's conversation number one, conversation about worldviews, right? We, unlike many other people in the world as Muslims, we believe that our faith informs every aspect of our life: the public arena, the private arena, the family domain, the societal domain, right? The individual inner realities, the external world, right? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is going to ask us about our inner state and our outer state, how we dealt with his rights, as our Lord, and how we dealt with the rights of people around us. And the Quran calls and teaches and calls towards that. Are there any questions on that part of it so far? Okay, awesome. Awesome. So we understand that having that worldview, right, really having a deep, deep engagement with the hereafter will impact how you live your life, what you do and what you choose not to do. The second conversation, the second introductory conversation that I'd like to have is about some of the virtues of Surah al-Kahf. Some of the virtues of Surah al-Kahf. So there's a lot that's written about this, and some of you guys mentioned it already. But are there any virtues off the top of your head that anybody knows that have to do with Surah al-Kahf? And by virtues, I mean benefits that come from it, specific benefits that are specific to Surah al-Kahf. So I heard somebody mention earlier that it's something that we should recite at a certain interval. So I know what the interval is.
You read it on every Friday, and I know my mom told me that it benefits like your household and like protecting you from like poverty, and like benefits like your dad, like, or whoever's making money in the house, the man figure.
Okay. Anybody else?
So I'm pretty sure you're supposed to recite it, I guess, from like Maghrib the last day until Maghrib the next day. So Thursday Maghrib. Well, usually on Fridays. I don't know about Thursday, but I know like days start by Maghrib in like the Islamic calendar. But it's supposed to help you like for the day of judgment. Pretty sure.
Beautiful. I'm seeing some things in the chat. Inas, not just a set of beliefs, but a way of life. That's very, it's a very apt way to put it. We're studying on Fridays, correct? Is it Kanwal or Kanwal?
Oh, the N is silent. It's Kawad.
Oh, Kawal. Okay. Cool. Sorry?
I said Assalamu alaikum. Sorry.
Oh, gives you protection from the fitna of the Dajjal. Awesome. Sabir, awesome. Okay, so yes, it'll give you nur from one Friday to the next. Beautiful, beautiful. So there are a set of ahadith that are narrated regarding the virtues of Surah al-Kahf. And yes, it is something that we are encouraged to recite weekly on Fridays, and something that's really awesome and kind of, I guess, partly coincidental, partly thoughtful in a good way is that we have this conversation weekly on Thursday evenings, which, as someone mentioned, remind me your name, bro. You're talking about Thursday night or after Maghrib.
Oh, Samir.
So yes, Samir mentioned that the day of Friday in the Islamic kind of calendar starts on Thursday evening, right? The day starts after Maghrib and ends at Maghrib. So we are currently in the day of Friday, and so Surah al-Kahf should be recited anytime on Friday, whether it be from the beginning of the day, which starts at Maghrib, to the end of the day, which is Maghrib the next day, right? So a great reminder for ourselves weekly on Thursdays to try and recite it if we can. So I'll go through some of these ahadith. A lot of it echoes what you guys have mentioned already. One of them is narrated by Imam Ahmed, who reported from Abu Ishaq from Barra, that there was a man who was, during the time of Prophet, who was in his house and he was reciting Surah al-Kahf. And then an animal came into the house. Okay, and it started basically frightening the people in the house. All of a sudden there was a kind of cloud of comfort and serenity that overtook that person in their household, and the animal left and fled from it. And so that was mentioned to the Prophet ﷺ, and he said that continue reciting, because it is a source of tranquility that reveals and that descends during the recitation of the Quran, that descends by virtue and by means of the Quran, right? And so it's quite literally a comfort and peace that descends, not just in a spiritual sense, but also in a materialistic, physical sense as well, right? So somebody mentioned it brings blessings into your house. There's other hadith that mention that whoever memorizes and preserves 10 ayahs from the beginning, the first 10 ayahs of Surah al-Kahf, that person will be protected from the tribulation of the Dajjal. And the Dajjal, for those who don't know, is the false Messiah, the imposter, the great imposter that will come towards the end of times. And the Prophet ﷺ teaches us that this is the greatest tribulation that could befall people on earth, right? The greatest test of their faith. And he also tells us and mentions that there was no prophet that came except that they warned their people from the imposter of the last times, the false Messiah. So in this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says that memorizing the first 10 ayahs will be a protection from the Dajjal. And there are many different narrations to this effect. Some mention the first 10 ayahs, some mention the last 10 ayahs, some mention the first 3 ayahs, some mention any 10 ayahs. But all of that, when we combine those, what we find is that we should strive our best, if we can, to memorize the entire surah. If we can't do that, we should at the very least try to recite the entire surah on Fridays. If we can't do that, we should at least try to recite the first 10 and the last 10 ayahs of the surah, or memorize them. If we can't do that, then we do the first 10 ayahs, at least recite them, memorize them if we can. If not, at the very very least, we try and memorize the first 3 ayahs, right? And the first 3 ayahs are quite short. So hopefully we can all make that a goal to, for all of us to do the maximum. But if we're not able to do that, to at least memorize like the first 10 ayahs and the last 10 ayahs. And if not, at least the first 10. So again, we mentioned that, the first 3, the first 10, the last 10, this will all be a protection from the tribulation of the false Messiah. Additionally, right, as was mentioned as well, that Surah al-Kahf also serves as a light and a guidance for the person who recites it. In one narration, the Prophet ﷺ mentions, من قرأ أول سورة الكهف وآخرها كانت له نورا من قدمه إلى رأسه ومن قرأها كلها كانت له نورا ما بين الأرض إلى السماء. Whoever recites the first and last 10 ayahs of Surah Kahf, they have a light that emanates from their feet from the bottom of their feet to the top of their head, basically illuminating their entire body. And whoever recites the entirety of the surah has a light that emanates between them and the heavens. Okay, between them and the heavens. Another narration mentions that whoever recites Surah Al-Kahf on Friday, Allah will give that person a light from the bottom of their feet to the top of their head that reaches the heavens, and it will be a source of illumination for them on the Day of Judgment. And what is between the two Fridays, their sins between the two Fridays will be forgiven. Okay, from one Friday to the next, their sins will be forgiven. Another narration mentions that that person's light will disseminate from their body in this earth to the Bayt al-Atiq, which is basically like the equivalent of the Kaaba in the heavens, that the angels do tawaf around, right? Where the angels worship Allah in the heavens, their light will disseminate from this earth till there. Another narration mentions that it will be a light and a guidance for that person from one Friday to the next. So that will be a light for that person from one Jum'ah to the next. Okay. Now we understand this to be a spirit in a spiritual sense, but also in a physical sense and in a material sense as well, that it will be a source of illumination and a guidance for that person. And there are many narrations, again, as we mentioned, to this effect. Okay. Another narration mentions that whoever recites it on the day of Friday will be protected from every calamity and every tribulation for a period of time. Okay, including the tribulation of the Dajjal, the false Messiah. Okay, so these are again some. What about listening to the surah instead of reciting? It's a great question. So we are tasked with doing what is in our ability. Okay, and so some of us, that might be a very lofty prospect to try and recite the whole surah or even memorize it, right? It's something that kind of gives us pause and maybe a source for concern. We should do the best that we can. So if we're able to recite it and read it, we should do so, right? If reading the entire thing is difficult, we should recite part of it. If reading the Arabic of it, maybe we're not a place where we can read that, then listening to it is a great option. And as we listen to it, we should try and follow along with the Quran open. So as we're listening to it, we're kind of following along with it as well, right? And then for many of us, majority of us, right, we should also try and read the translation if we can. So we understand and read, we understand what we're reading, and the more that we can do, if we're able to read a book of Tafsir on it in English, that's great as well. If we're able to kind of listen to something on it and learn more about it, like we're doing in this class, that's great as well, right? So every week we should try and implement and put into practice what we're learning here today. So we're listening to it, we're talking about Surah Kahf on Thursday evening, which is Friday, then we try and read part of it, right? We try to implement it. So whatever we can, if all we can do is listen, that's better than not doing anything, right? If we can listen and follow along as we're reading, that's even better. So hopefully that's a bit of answer that provides somewhat of clarity on the question. So these are some of the benefits. And on the topic about the false Messiah specifically, it's something that we'll get into a little bit more as we go through the surah in a little bit more depth. But what we can understand is that what the surah discusses, the concepts that are brought up in the surah, will typically or will greatly be the sources of deception that the Dajjal will bring, be it in the realm of testing one's faith, being in the realm of using wealth as a means to deceive people, right? Giving them material things, being able to do things that can't be explained, right? Having control and dominion over the earth, being able to to control this area of the world and that area and travel from this place to the next, right? These are all things that will be part of that difficult test. And it was something that the Prophet ﷺ himself sought refuge from and taught us to seek refuge from as well, right? So nobody should think, well, I'd really like to see that day. None of us really wants to see that day. The next piece of, is there any questions on any of that so far? Okay, cool. The next piece of intro that I'd like to get into is setting up the context of the surah. And if possible, I'd like to go through some of the first few ayahs today, maybe in the last 10 minutes or so. But before that, we understand the context of the surah, okay? So there's a thing in the study of Quranic interpretation, which is tafsir, called sabab al-nuzul, which in Arabic, which in English means the circumstances or the context of revelation, right? What were the circumstances that took place during the life of the Prophet ﷺ, during which these verses in the surah was revealed? So in the books of tafsir, the scholars of tafsir mention that there was an incident so this surah, by the way, first of all, it was Meccan revelation. So the life of the Prophet ﷺ is split up into two, okay? For a period of 13 years, the Prophet ﷺ, during his prophethood, he lived in Mecca, okay? And then the migration happened to Medina. And the last 10 years of his life and his prophethood, the Prophet ﷺ lived and resided in Medina. So all the Quran that's revealed in that first period is known as Meccan revelation. And all the Quran that was revealed in that second period is known as Medinan revelation. And the life situation of the believers was quite different in both of those circumstances. Can anybody kind of highlight some of the key differences between the Meccan period of the Prophet ﷺ's life and the Medinan period of his life? Does anybody know any of those distinctions?
The Meccan period was more quiet. It was the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba were in a lot of they were in really tough times, and then the Medinan period, obviously, they were able to practice more freely and like there was more prosperity.
Awesome, beautiful. So the Meccan period, as was mentioned, was characterized by a lot of strife and turmoil and tribulation, persecution, harassment, torture, violence against the young Muslim community. And the call to Islam began as something very private, something very quiet, and eventually started to grow slowly and slowly and slowly. The Medinan period is when we see Islam spread through a civilization and have a governing structure, right? Be an independent kind of authority, right? Medina is now a place that has its own governance, that is led and directed by the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims, right? Mecca was not that way until the Medinan period when they came back after the conquest, right? So we understand the believers living as a minority and then living as a majority, living in difficulty and persecution, and then living in relative safety, or we say relative because many of the battles, or actually all of the battles that took place, all of the wars that took place against the Muslims were in the Medinan period. So very different circumstances. So we said this was which period? Surah al-Kahf was revealed in which period? See who remembers.
The Meccan period.
Second period. Beautiful. Okay. So I want you to imagine that the believers are in a condition where, maybe some of their own family members have been killed. Okay. For adopting this faith and this belief. They're in a condition where, they're constantly living in fear, right? When they leave their house under the threat of persecution, under the threat of boycott, right? Under the threat of, being disowned by their own family, right? Under the threat of not being engaged with and traded with in society, and having their means of life kind of restricted in this condition. And they're enduring this for quite some time, right? They're enduring this for quite some time. It's reaching a breaking point. It's reaching a point of difficulty. And this is the circumstances in which the surah was revealed. Now, the disbelievers, or those who opposed the Muslims in Mecca, were largely polytheists. So they didn't believe in any of the Abrahamic faiths, but rather they worshiped idols. The faith-based communities, the closest faith-based community, was in Medina at the time, before the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims migrated there. Okay, and these were the Jews that lived in Medina. So the Quran was mentioning or bringing stories about previous prophets, the religions of old, the peoples of old, and the Meccans, they didn't really have that context. Okay, they weren't like, again, they didn't have a book in a scripture, right? They had to defer to the people of the book, the Jews and the Christians, for those things. And so they dispatched two people from Mecca, from the Quraysh, which was those who controlled Mecca, and also the tribe from which the Prophet ﷺ was from. They dispatched two people to Medina to speak with the rabbis, okay, and to see if they had any context or any sort of indication in their scripture that alluded to the Prophet ﷺ or the coming of a new messenger, or anything that kind of resembled what he was talking about, his message, okay? Now, mind you, the Jews of Medina at this time themselves, because of their understanding of scripture, were awaiting the next prophet. He had not yet come to Medina, but they inhabited the city that the scriptures described he would come to, which was Medina, okay? Their assumption and understanding was that just as all the previous prophets had come before, not all of them, but all the recent ones up until that time, that prophet would be from the children of Israel, okay? So after Prophet Abraham, Prophet Abraham had two sons that that we mention often, right? Which was Ismail alayhi salam and Ishaq alayhi salam. The two of them, from their progeny, came, various prophets and various peoples. Okay, Ishaq alayhi salam, all of his progeny were known as the children of Israel. Okay, the children of Yaqub, which was Ishaq's son. The Prophet ﷺ comes from the lineage of who? Ismail or Ishaq? Isaac or Ishmael?
Is it Ismail?
Ismail. But every prophet prior to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, came from the lineage of who? So there's two sons, Isaac, Ishaq, Ismail, Ishmael.
Yaqub.
Right. So Yaqub by way of Ishaq, right? So Isaac, whose son was Jacob, Yaqub, who had 12 sons, and they all had their progeny. All of the prophets, Moses, Jesus, all of these prophets in that period come from Ishaq, which were the children of Israel, which were the Jews, their kind of ancestors. So they assumed that this next prophet would also be from that progeny as well. So they were inhabiting the place, long story short, where they believed that he would arrive. Okay. So the Meccans, they sent two people to go and interface with them and kind of ask them some questions. They sent two people named An-Nadr bin Harith and Uqba bin Abi Mu'ayt, who were prominent people within Mecca, to go to these rabbis and ask them some questions about this prophet, Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, who and what he was talking about. So they said, go to these people, ask them about Muhammad ﷺ, describe him to them, and tell them what he's calling to and what he's saying, because they are the original peoples of the book and they have knowledge that we don't have about prophets. So they went out, they headed to Medina, they asked these rabbis about the Prophet ﷺ, they described him to them, what he's calling towards, what he's saying, right? What his people are believing, how they're living. And they said, you are the people of the Torah, of the book. So we came to you for you to tell us about, this person that we're describing. So the Jews of Medina, they told these two deputies to go and ask this man 3 questions. Ask him about 3 things. If he tells you about them successfully, then he is the prophet. He's a prophet sent by God. If he doesn't, if he's not able to answer these questions, right, then do whatever you want with him, because he's an imposter. Okay? These 3 questions were: number 1, ask him about a group of young people who left their tribe, who left their people, at some point in time, in the earlier times, in the earlier generations, what was their situation? Because they had a very strange and a very remarkable situation that took place. Very, kind of vague, this description, okay? Ask him about a man who traveled between the east and the west of the world. What was his story? What was his situation? Okay? And ask him about the soul. What is the soul and what is the nature of the soul? So if he is able to answer you these questions, if he's able to tell you about these things, then follow him. Again, if he's not able to tell you about these things, then he is somebody who's just saying things, making things up. So, do whatever you want with him and take care of him however you wish, because he's an imposter. Okay. So they come back to Mecca. They tell their people about this. They tell Quraysh about this. We've come to you with this, with this knowledge and this information from the Jews, from the rabbis of Medina. And they told us to ask him 3 things, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what we're going to do. Okay. So they go to the Prophet ﷺ and they say, "Oh Muhammad, ya Muhammad, akhbirna, tell us about these 3 things." So they asked him about those matters. So the Prophet ﷺ said, "Ukhbirukum ghadan bima sa'altukum an." I will inform you about these things tomorrow. Okay. And he didn't say, inshallah. He just said, I'll tell you about these things tomorrow. Right. And this ayah will come up, hopefully, probably next time when we discuss, the ayah in reference to the specific statement of the Prophet ﷺ that I'll tell you tomorrow. And he didn't say, inshallah. So he turns, he goes back home and he spends, he's basically waiting for revelation to come about these issues. Okay. What happens is revelation doesn't come that next day. It doesn't come the next day after that. It doesn't come the next day after that. It doesn't come the next day after that. It doesn't come for 15 days. So throughout this 15-day period, you can imagine that the disbelievers in Mecca are like, okay, this guy is a joke. This guy, is stalling. He doesn't know what he's talking about. We've caught him red-handed. He's an imposter. He's a liar. And this period is also quite difficult for the Prophet ﷺ because not necessarily from the perspective of, that being, a mark of embarrassment or anything like that for him, but more so from the perspective of him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, being so concerned with them accepting and believing in this truth that he has brought, and each passing moment being more of a potential for them to steep further into rejecting it. So this was a cause of concern and distress for him that, that they wouldn't believe, that this may be a reason for them not to believe. Okay. Eventually, after 15 days, the revelation does come, and it mentions not only the questions that they've asked, but also adds additional details as well. Okay. Of those 3 questions that they asked, 2 of them are addressed in Surah al-Kahf, and 1 of them is addressed in Surah al-Isra, which in the chronological order, or not the chronological order, but the organization of the Quran comes before Surah al-Kahf, right? Surah number 17. And that was about the matter of the soul. The question about the soul was addressed in Surah al-Isra, Surah number 17, and the other 2 questions were addressed in Surah al-Kahf, Surah number 18. And again, these, these accounts were mentioned. Okay. So this is the context, the general circumstances of revelation. Now, I did want to get into the first few ayahs of the surah, but we only have a couple minutes left. So what I'll do is I'll kind of just, I guess, introduce them briefly, and then we'll kind of get into them a little bit more next week. Okay. But the agreement has to be, which ayahs were these? Ines, do you mind elaborating on your question? Which ayahs were these? You're talking about the three issues that they asked about? So in Surah al-Isra, the question about the soul, right, was the ayah وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلِ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي, which, let me find the ayah number for you. It's surah number 17, ayah number 85. And the other 2 about the youth in the cave, that is a number of ayat, starting with ayah number 9 in Surah Kahf. Surah number 18, ayah number 9 is where that story starts. And about the man who traveled east and west, that's sort of the Qur'an, which starts, the story of that starts in on ayah number 83. Ayah number 83, surah number 18. And we'll get into that in the coming weeks, inshallah. So we're right here at 7:59. I think it's probably better that we conclude rather than trying to very quickly go through some of the first few ayat. I do request and ask that in the next coming weeks that hopefully, and I'll try to hold myself to this as well, that we're able to start on time so that we can end within an hour and get as much done as we can. But are there any questions based on anything that we discussed today before we conclude here?
I had a question about the source for the hadith, Imam Ahmed's. Could you clarify on that, inshallah?
So which hadith in particular?
The one about the tranquility of Surah al-Kahf.
Sure. Yes. So that hadith is again recorded in the book of Imam Ahmed. So his collection of hadith is called the Musnad of Imam Ahmed. It was reported by Barra, who was a companion of the Prophet, Barra ibn Azib. And I don't know the specific hadith number. But I can find the specific hadith number for you if that's what you are, if that's what you're requesting. Is that what you're looking for, the hadith number, or are you just looking for the collection in which it comes?
Yeah, I'm looking for the hadith number, inshallah.
Okay, so I will give you the hadith number, inshallah, next week, if that's okay.
Yeah, JazakAllah.
No problem. Any other questions on anything we discussed so far? So that conversation about worldviews is going to become, increasingly important. So it's something that I want everybody to keep in mind as we continue and go through the ayats of the surah. And even especially in the first few, again, I wanted to kind of cover those today, but we'll have to kind of join them in with next week. But yeah, any other final thoughts, questions, concerns before we conclude? Okay, so action items this week and every week were what? I know you guys are on college and stuff for most of you, so I'm not going to give you any additional homework or anything I'm going to follow up on. Just something that, inshallah, this becomes actual practice in our lives and not just a conversation about theory and, and philosophizing. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Catherine. So read Surah al-Kahf if you can. Again, we're already in the day of Friday. So if you have some time tonight, or, the best time for you is tonight, try and read it tonight. If not, at some point tomorrow. And yes, read it with the meaning if you're able to. If listening to it is easier for you, or listening to it in addition to reading, but the most blessing comes from us trying to read it ourselves. So I encourage you all to do that, inshallah. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, except from us, we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala open up his revelation and his guidance to us, that we're able to imbibe it and embrace it with our hearts and live it with our lives and bring it to life with our limbs, that we understand it, I think, correctly, that he protects us from any errors in our understanding, any errors in our interpretations, any errors in our acting on it. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allow us to be people who live by his guidance, his revelation. We ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us people of truth. And we ask that Allah forgive us for any of our shortcomings, anything that we said that was in errors from ourselves, anything that we said that was in truth and that was correct is solely from him. And we ask that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala increase us. We ask that he bless us and that he send his salawats, his mercy and his blessings upon our beloved messenger Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, upon his family, his companions, all who follow in their footsteps until the day of judgment, and that he make us amongst them. Subhanakallahumma bihamdik. نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى اللهم وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Just a quick announcement. I'm Catherine. I'm one of the board members. First of all, JazakAllah Khair, Brother Naeem. This is really great, and may Allah reward you for taking the time to go through Surah al-Kahf with us in the upcoming weeks. So I wanted to quickly touch on Charity Week, which has been going on this week. The goal of Charity Week is to raise money for orphans and needy children in a number of different countries, some of them being Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, Nigeria. So some of the upcoming events that we have are tomorrow we're having a Jeopardy. The day after we're having an escape room. Tomorrow we have bake-off submissions due, and we have dares running all throughout the rest of the week. So if you follow us on Instagram, you can go to the bio and there's a link tree where you can find all the links to sign up for those. Make sure to do them ASAP. And we also have a launch good in the link tree where you can donate to the cause. So we would really appreciate your donations. It's going to be a great cause. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reward you for your contributions. Oh, thank you, Koa. Yes, that's the link.
Really quickly, sorry, before we conclude, I believe, was it Saber who had the question about the hadith?
Yeah.
So yes, the hadith is in Sahih Bukhari, number 3614. It's also in Sahih Muslim, number 795, and also in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, chapter, the fourth volume in hadith number 281.
Okay, JazakAllah. Yeah, it's easy.
All right, no problem. All right, sorry, the last point. Sorry to interrupt the announcements if I did. Hopefully see everybody next week, inshallah, and I hope you guys enjoy your week, enjoy your weekend, and recite Surah al-Kahf. Assalamu alaikum.